Welcome to the Cosmia Festival June Book Club. Finally, a little bit later than advertised. So we are going to be talking about a brilliant book this month, The Bloodprint by Ausma Zehanant Khan. This is a book that I bought ages ago, ages ago, because I read a really interesting blog on the on kind of writers of South Asian descent, and particularly kind of Muslim writers. And there were about 3 or 4 books on that list that I thought, yes, I really want to read those books. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my hands on them and add them to my reading list. And they've been sitting on my shelves, and this is the first of those books that I've come to as we start to prepare for this year's Cosmia Festival. So the things that attracted me to the book were obviously this blog was like gushing about it. The story seemed interesting. The artwork is absolutely beautiful on this edition of the book, and it just seemed like a really good punt for me. And in this spirit of trying to read authors from backgrounds that are not like my own, it seemed like a really good purchase. So I picked it up, it sat on the shelves, and I finally had the opportunity to read it, and I'm so glad that I did. It's a really interesting book, and I hope that those of you that have read it yourselves also found it really interesting, and you think it's worth us talking about it now. So let me start by telling you a little bit about the author, Ausma Khan. She was born to Pakistani parents who moved to Britain. She was born just down the road from us here in Huddersfield in Leicester, spent a bit of time in Birmingham, and then the family moved to Canada, and she is now based in the US. So she's got quite an international overview anyway, which also comes through in her PhD in international human rights law. She is a devout Muslim, and her fiction and non-fiction explores these areas of her identity. And this book and the series that it forms part of is drawn from her expertise in that area, human rights law, as well as responding to her own culture and heritage. So it's a really interesting, she's got a really interesting story in her own right, I think. She began her career as a mystery author who turned a fantasy writer. And I think there's a lot to be said for the influence of mystery and crime writing on genre writing. I think quite often stories have at their heart a central mystery or a crime to be solved, and that is the thing that drives the plot. So that's kind of where we're starting from. The thing that jumped out at me as well, and I kind of knew I was in good hands, was that from the very beginning, from page 1 in the thanks, there is a reference to The Princess Bride. And I was like, yep, I am on board. This is going to be a book that I'm going to enjoy. Now, I have a confession to make. I think, assumed wrongly that this was pitched as a young adult book. I'd been buying a lot of YA fiction, and particularly fantasy, that was in this kind of space. But I'm not sure that that's entirely true. I could see how that might be a market for this, but it's also quite a dark book. And I think it occupies an interesting space where lots of people are able to get a lot from this work. So let's just talk quickly about the basics. The book was published in October 2017, and it's part 1 of a 4-part series that are the Corsian Archives series. So I think she put 1 out each year. So the final book in the series was published last year, 2020, which is brilliant. As you know, if you're a regular viewer, I love a series. I love anything like this where I can really get my teeth into a story. So it's really nice to have this kind of here ready to go, and I'm just adding a link to our Facebook page. Okay, so yeah, it's a really great thing to have, and I'm really excited that there's other books in this series that I can read and continue this story and really get into the characters. So what else is in the basics? So this story is set in a kind of fictionalized, we would kind of say Middle East here, but essentially what would have been historically Persia and is now modern day parts of Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the author talks a lot about the reading she did about the Silk Road, which was a incredibly important trade route through the East, particularly up until the medieval period and beyond. And this story is kind of inspired by those places, that history, that legacy of the Silk Road and its importance for trade, for culture, for ideas. It's also a story that is massively influenced by the author's family experience. It talks about the places, the myths, the legends, the stories of her heritage, but also about her experiences researching the Balkans conflict and human rights violations and war crimes. So there's a lot of dark stuff in here. And the story's got some very ambitious goals. And I've got some quotes from Ausma Khan at the end where we can kind of explore maybe some of her motivations for writing this story. Now, in terms of the plot, this is the beginning of this spoilerness of this exercise. So I'm going to be going into what happens in the story. So if you've not read the Bloodprint, pause this video, go away, come back and watch it on the catch-up, because otherwise I'm going to spoil things for you. Obviously, it's only part one of the story, so and I only know part one. So if I inadvertently spoil parts 2, 3, and 4, I'm doing it completely by chance, completely by accident. I'm not trying to ruin your experience. So the plot. The plot follows a kind of, in like a lot of fantasy stories, an adventure. We have got a kind of quite extensive cast of characters, but we essentially follow kind of 4 or 5 of them on a adventure story where our main character, Arian, her companion, Cinia, and other people that go with her are going to find a thing. They're going to find that kind of not quite MacGuffin, but it's like an ethereal grail quest, and she talks about the influence of King Arthur on the writing. So these characters are given this character is given this task, and it gradually amasses a bunch of friendly companions, and they go on a fantastical adventure kind of down the Silk Road-ish or around the Silk Road area to get to their destination. And as like all good part ones do, it ends on a cliffhanger. So the story is mostly told from the perspective of our lead character, Ariane, but we do get some thoughts and feelings from some of the other main characters along the way. It's mostly pretty linear. We've talked about some very complicated books on this book club, but this is a pretty linear present story with a few flashbacks that are normally told in recollection rather than action discreetly taking place in another time. So the story isn't necessarily doing anything massively tricksy in terms of its structure. It's a really nice, kind of comfortable framing that I think allows for some quite dark storytelling in amongst that kind of very nice adventure narrative structure. And I think those two things work really well together. So let's talk a bit more about the setting before we get on to the complicated bits and pieces. So as I mentioned, this story is set in a kind of fictionalized East of a kind of an unknown period. And the author says this is set on the Silk Road, it's set on this pathway. There's a map at the beginning of the book. You know I love a map. The map kind of gives a sense of this. And it represents one possible future of the kind of broken history. So you've kind of got family, Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, kind of all together, and kind of fictionalized versions of some of those real life places. So I'm just going to kind of show you very quickly the map. So we've kind of got this world here. As you can see, kind of from a distance there, we're kind of essentially looking at could be kind of like an India, and then you've kind of got the area above it, and then this is kind of Africa. So it's a really kind of clear kind of version of history. And then the bottom map here is this kind of area in the box where we're specifically looking at. So I think because So this does two really good things, I think. One of those is that it looks back to that kind of historical world, but because some of the action also takes place in what is now modern day Pakistan, Afghanistan, those links to the Taliban are really clear. And the setting is a kind of war-torn world where a fundamentalist, slightly faith-based, ignorance is power for their power-based organization have kind of swept away much of the existing rich heritage of the region. Books are burned or banned, and things are basically in a pretty bad state. There are other factions here, but mostly authoritarian, totalitarian, fascistic rulers are reigning in most of the places. You get glimpses in the story of this rich history that is being lost, and these kind of fantastical places almost out of time in every nook and cranny. So around every corner there's an interesting tower or castle or vale which is full of the kind of magic and mystery of the past. And I really like that idea, and the author talks quite a bit about being inspired by some of that folklore that she heard growing up, and I think there's probably lots about this world that I don't know that there would be resonances for me if I did, but I like that sense that that's there. The other thing that's kind of coming across here is the intersection between your, as she describes it, tribalism, your kind of family, extended family identity, and kind of other identities, so kind of faith. These are all intersecting in this world. I really like this setting, as I think I've made pretty clear. The places that are visited aren't necessarily visited for very long. This is an adventure story. There's a lot of kind of passing through of places, but a lot of thought has been put into the relationships between all these various countries and peoples in those countries and those overlapping layers of identity. And that is it's been really, really thought through, and it really adds to the setting. So every place that the action occurs, there are divided loyalties, there are surprising perspectives, there is kind of hidden information which is revealed. So when you go to somewhere on the story, you're expecting there to be twists and turns. Not everything is as it seems. Not everything is being given perfect information. And I think that is really cool. I'm just having a little quick look at my notes. So that's probably the kind of the answer in terms of setting. I think it's also worth saying that sometimes with fantasy, it's easy to play that game of, oh, this could be like somewhere I know. Game of Thrones is a good example. That map, the map of Westeros, looks very much like Great Britain, a lot bigger though. So it's easy to try and draw some of those illusions. But I think with the Bloodprint, because it's so based on history, it's so based on the geography of the area, I think it can really bring it alive. I think something I will probably do when I read the next book is, have Google Maps open in front of me, or have Wikipedia open in front of me, so I can be looking up some of these places, so I can really start to put them in my mind and start to translate some of the names of places in the book into real life places, because I think that's going to be a fun game for me to play and see how much of it is based in kind of historical geographical fact. Okay, it's time to move on, talk about the characters. So our first character, our main character, is Arian. Now, Arian is the first Auralist. She is a member of a small group of women who are determined to keep the flame of knowledge and power alive. We'll talk a bit about the claim a little bit later on. The author talks about giving this character, Arian, a background similar to her own. She kind of represents a kind of ethnic Pathan Pashtun woman, which is a large ethnic group in Pakistan and Afghanistan. This is a ethnic group who've been really impacted by the Taliban and their control of women, and the subjugation, disenfranchisement of women. So is a good kind of so Ariane partly stands in for that kind of thing. I think what is really interesting about Ariane as well, there's loads of interesting things about Ariane. Firstly, she's very strong, very independent. She's got an important position, but she's not in charge. So she has to follow orders, but she has her own mind. She has her own motivations. She has her own issues that she's dealing with. One of those is being essentially, in the West, we would probably describe her as something like a warrior nun. Her faith is most important, and that has precluded romantic relationships with others, and it has precluded that kind of full life. She's got a duty, she's got her faith, and those things are continually challenged by lots of people throughout the story. So she represents quite a lot of things going on there. She's accompanied by another great character, Cinia, who is a younger companion of less skill, but very good with a bow and arrow, who is kind of jealous and kind of not. And we might talk about the jealousy a little bit towards the end. We also have the kind of brooding, mysterious silver mage, Danyar. So Danyar has, in this book at least, some slightly vaguely alluded to responsibilities for keeping faith and magic alive. We've got Weifu, a boy that they rescue, who has a fierce loyalty to them, and Turan as well, who comes in partway through and doesn't quite make it to the end. Remember, I said spoilers. The other kind of characters that I thought were worth mentioning at this stage were the Black Khan, who is a prince with very dodgy motives, who is throughout the story, and we never quite know what his perspectives are. And I think possibly speaks to some of the things that happened in Afghanistan, which is if you back somebody that says that they're on your side, they might turn out eventually to not be on your side, and they could be worse than the thing you're trying to stop. This is just a prediction from me, but that's the vibe I get. And also the talisman. So essentially a version of the Taliban. I don't think there's a particular character in there that I want to pull out, but I think in a way that the grouping of them has its own character, which is fundamentalists, people who are reveling in their power and have been convinced that kind of power and authority and the pursuit of more power is the only thing that's important, to the detriment of the experiences of everybody else. I really enjoyed the characters. I think they were less important than I think the story and the themes. There's quite a strong romance story here, which I don't think the author gets asked about as much as she'd like, from what I can gather from the interviews. And a lot of kind of pent-up desire. I think the other thing that really comes across is that a lot of the characters, if not all of the characters, are dealing with suppressed or barely suppressed rage. Even the people who are on top in the society are angry. Everybody is angry, and nobody is getting any healing. And I think that's a really interesting way of telling a story where everybody's dealing with a lot of crap and nobody's dealing with it very well, and everybody's kind of almost going at each other most of the time. Not everybody, but most people, because they are so angry, and that kind of tension kind of boiling up all the time is a really good flavor, and I think also a good thematic element of the storytelling. So as always, I like to talk about some of the themes that you find in this story, and the first one of those, I suppose, is about knowledge. And in the Bloodprint, the story is looking at knowledge. It's looking at the importance of knowledge, who controls knowledge, and where knowledge is set down. And I think this is maybe where we talk about the claim first as some context. So in the Bloodprint, the claim is a set of magical words, magical texts that for people who have the skill and who are trained, uttering the words is a magical incantation. So they can do physical things in the world by uttering the claim. But the claim is also about identity. It's also about wisdom. So it's a religious text. It's a text about the one. There's been in the past a prophet who has kind of brought the claim to the people, I think, and then has died or has been martyred. So it is a religious text that has been lost. It's a religious text that has been in part perverted. So it occupies a space that is different from our own world, where in our own world, the religious texts can be used as weapons. They can be distorted and used as weapons in their entirety. In the story of the Bloodprint, that's not quite true, because most of the words have been erased. They have been taken away from the world. They are being scrubbed off buildings. So in the Bloodprint, the claim is both the religious text and the secular knowledge, almost. Whereas if you look at contemporary examples, look at the Taliban, look at other fundamentalist sects, particularly in the Middle East and the East, there's an erasure of secular text and a promotion of one interpretation of one religious text. So it's a little bit more nuanced than the Bloodprint, which I thought was really interesting. I think quite often you don't get that kind of nuance around those kind of magical texts in fantasy writing, not ones I've read anyway. Please correct me in the comments. So there's a lot there about knowledge and who owns knowledge. So the other thing that I think is interesting, and it ties in with another theme for me, which is about language, is about oral knowledge and written knowledge. So in the world of the Bloodprint, what we have is a world of oral knowledge. Mostly knowledge of the claim, knowledge of what's going on in other parts, knowledge of what's happened in the past is only surviving as an oral tradition. Our lead character is the first oralist. She is a linguist rather than somebody who's looking at language, written down language, although she can read and write. So there's an element here of oral tradition. And I think looking at the kind of violent history of the area this is responding to, that sense of knowledge, surviving cataclysm, surviving war, surviving occupation, is a really important one. On the flip side of that is written knowledge. And we're existing in a world where written knowledge is being erased. Written knowledge is being erased from buildings. It's being erased from libraries. Books are being burned. Places where writing is being stored are being removed. People who can read and write are being rounded up. So written knowledge is being portrayed as an evil, and it's something that should be stamped out. And all of this is about control, another big theme here in the book, which is control. And I think there's some really great nuance in here, some really dark nuance in here, and some interesting reflections on the way that this happens in the real world, not only in extreme cases, but also in less extreme cases where people in authority are trying to limit access to written material and then trying to dominate the spoken knowledge transfer and to also shape language. So loads in there, I think, to unpack. So if you've got comments, if you've got thoughts about knowledge and language in this story, you can leave them in the comments live or leave them on the catch-up video as well. It'd be great to hear them afterwards. So let's move on to talk a bit about control. And this really is at the heart of the story. We'll look at some of the author's quotes, I think, when we get to the end of the video. But the story is all about who has control and who has control over who. One of the really strong emotive elements of this book is the enslavement of women. So very literally that control over other people. It's often held up alongside the destruction of knowledge as the worst crime of the talisman is the enslavement of women and the enslavement of people and the control over everybody. Essentially, we're seeing a world that is a police state, and when we get into the later story, the other place that they travel to is worse. That's more like the Stasi, I suppose. All dissenters are rounded up, and all knowledge transmission is removed. And what I think is interesting is you get a sense of two totalitarian states at the end who have very different perspectives, very different reasons for doing things, who have found a connection between that, a connection between their kind of wanting to control people. And they can see, in fact, three states who all kind of want to control people, and they've found a way that they can help each other to do that, which is terrifying and frightening. And it's a really dark turn in the story when you start to get a sense of that actually these authoritarian organizations are working together to subjugate people. There is also there's also smaller elements of control here. So one of those is about the companions of Hera. We haven't talked about those yet, but I think I'm going to talk about that in our kind of things that occur to me section. But the Companions of Hera is the organization that our lead character, Ariane, belongs to. And she's quite important in there, and she has the respect of people in there, but she's not in charge. And one of the first things that happens in the story is that control of her changes. She spent a long time kind of following orders, but following what she wants to do, and then suddenly she's put on the rails. She's told, this is what you're going to have to do now, go and do it. Don't get distracted, this is the thing you've got to do, and I'm in control of you. And she's manipulated then all the way along to follow a set control path. So I think there's an element here of even the companions are being corrupted by the sense that people have to be controlled. It's not enough to just have ideas and an ideology and faith and express yourself within those bounds. It's about you have to follow this ideology in a way that I think is the right way to do it. So I think there's a lot of parallels in the way that companions are moving under their leader with the society at large, and this kind of poisonous idea that everything needs to be controlled that seems to be spreading across the whole region. So again, love to know your comments about that. The next two themes, I think, are probably interlinked, which are about war and devastation. And this is where Ausma Khan's experience, her background, researching international human rights in the context of the Balkan War, I think really comes through. You get a real sense of the aftermath of war and the devastation that can be caused by civil unrest and war activity. And I think this is something that you don't often get in fantasy, or you didn't traditionally get in fantasy. You didn't spend hours and hours in the town of Dale seeing what happened at the end of The Hobbit. The victory is enough, but you do get that in fantasy in terms of characters starting out in devastation. But I think the Bloodprint does, which is interesting, is it gives you a nuanced tour of that devastation. Now, the introduction of the talisman to kind of show the Taliban is pretty kind of basic level. I think it's quite an obvious to the reader, but I think you do get a really nuanced sense of the impact of these actions on people on the ground. Not just in terms of ruined buildings and destroyed monuments, but in terms of the culture of fear and the distorted loyalties. Again, there's some quotes I think we'll look at the end. How living under that kind of warlike mentality and living with the devastation of war can have a profound impact on how much hope you have, whether you're likely to rebel or whether you're likely to conform to what people are telling you what to do, and how people can make personal choices to do one or the other, which I think is really interesting. Now, the other thing that kind of occurred to me about war is that this story talks a lot about the fact that it's happening in the context of a war that has happened. And it's a war that intrigues me because it's a war that's called the War of the Far Range. Now, when you look at the map, this is where all the activity is happening. And the Far Range is kind of over here. So it's not necessarily the case that the Far Range is something that's happening on the doorstep. So is this invasion that's been fought off? On this map, that would kind of be probably China, maybe Russia, that are coming down from the Far Range. So has there been an invasion? There's quite a lot of allusions to and kind of connections to the Mongol emperors in this story. You know, was it the kind of Mongol invasion? You know, Genghis Khan. Are we living in that context where it's trying to rebuild after something so cataclysmic has disrupted society so fundamentally? I want to kind of know more, I suppose, about that far range war and the effect it has had on people. And there is this kind of the Shin War, this kind of martial race who we hear a lot about in this story. The impact of that war on those martial people, the talisman seems to have emerged in parallel, on top, in and amongst, at odds to that society. So a kind of martial society that has been perverted to be a fundamentalist society as well. And the dangers that as soon as you get people who are good with swords also saying that their view is the only one and there's no room for anybody else is a really dangerous combination. So let's move on to talk a bit about race and faith. This is something we're talking a lot about in Cosmia Book Club this year as we look at diversity in storytelling and writers. So it's no surprise that it features really heavily in this story. And again, like a lot of the big issues here, there's a lot of nuance about it. I've kind of alluded to a bit already, but all of the characters here, our main characters that we follow, their tribal identity, the color of their skin, the faith they have, they're all a major part of their journeys. They're all kind of, I think because the author is trying to interrogate those interactions between different peoples and ideas in history through fantasy, they have to be at the heart of what happens to these characters. So let me give you some examples so you understand what I mean. So our main character, Arian, is from the same kind of tribal identity as the talisman, the kind of Taliban, essentially. But she's fundamentally not the same as them in anything. Her parents aren't the same as them. They're fundamentally opposed. So I think what this allows the author to do is talk about the experience of being a Muslim woman in a world that in lots of areas treats anybody who follows Islam as an enemy of the state and as something to be suspicious of. And that experience of saying, well, actually, I'm a person of faith, but I'm a person of faith that is part of you, not a person of faith that is part of them. So treat them separately. And I think it allows the author to really demonstrate and to show emotionally and through storytelling that the talisman are not one thing. They're not they are happen to be mostly from one kind of tribal identity, but that doesn't mean that they are also all of that tribal identity, if that makes sense. So I think that is a really interesting, and obviously that would go for any peoples that were being judged in that way and seeing everybody as being the same. So I think that's really interesting. We can also look at Cinia, the companion who is black, and I think from the map probably comes from the kind of, let me have a little look at this map again, would come from Africa essentially. So we've got, so possibly could be Egypt or something like that. It's got on here the lands of the Negus, which is across the Sea of Reeds, which is kind of like the Red Sea. So yeah, what we're kind of looking at here, I think, is what we're looking at is a kind of is somebody that is outside of the experiences of most of the people in this story, and is seen thus as being incredibly exotic, or of interest or not of interest. It's really interesting. So I think that character allows the author to kind of bring in some of that exoticism that is normally the purview of Asian characters in stories. They're often seen as exotic, and it's kind of a bit flipped here, so that you can start to see, well, this is what those other stories are doing with those characters. That might be what she intended. I don't know. We've also got Wei Fu, the lad who comes from he's essentially kind of a war orphan who's been kind of kidnapped and pressed into service with the slavers. So he has a racial identity. We meet his people, but he has absolutely no knowledge or affiliation with them. So really demonstrating that it's about culture and upbringing, not about what you look like or what your genetics are, that is a fundamental part of who you are. But also that sadness of what war can do, what controlling and cruel governments or rulers can do is divorce people from that sense of culture and that sense of heritage. And Weifu's people are incredibly passionate. I'm saying Weifu like that's his name. I'm just going to double check. That they're incredibly passionate about lots of things, and he doesn't have that same kind of cultural experience. And I suppose it goes back to Wei Fa. That's what I should have been saying, Wei Fa. So yeah, that kind of goes back to things there. And then our last character that I think is really interesting to talk about is Danyar, a guardian of Kandor, who also goes by the Silver Mage, the Authenticate, and the Keeper of Kandor. He's an interesting character in lots of ways. He's a kind of very, very attractive, brooding, and principled man in love with our lead character. But he has some real complexity because he is also from this kind of warlike tribal peoples, but he is not of them. He can pass for them. He can kind of put himself in that world. He knows it inside out, but fundamentally, he's made a choice that there are things that are more important than his tribal identity, than his peoples. There are principles, there are things to believe in that are above all of those. So the author is, I suppose, talking about big issues here, is that, what's right isn't necessarily easy, and you've sometimes got to go against what your people or your community say is the right thing to do. So we talked a bit in terms of themes about culture, memory, folk tradition, and keeping them alive. So I won't belabor that anymore. But I did want to talk about another theme, which I've kind of touched on, which is about rage and loss. I mentioned before that all the characters seem to be living with rage. Sometimes it's suppressed, sometimes it's not. And towards the end of the story, you start to get a sense of what this really means for even characters who have got the best intentions, particularly our main character, Arian. So throughout the story, from the very beginning, she has had to kill for what she believes in. She's had to kill to rescue people, and she has accepted that that's something she's just got to do. It's not something she wants to do, but she's got to do it. But by the end of the story, she's been through so much that her relationship to the claim, to her knowledge, to her magic, she's starting down a dark path where what are the limits to do what you think is right? And is actually doing what's right the most important thing? And can people be corrupted by power, even if it's in the service of doing something right? I think this is something that's going to come through in the second story a lot more, and probably by the end of the fourth story, is if you're fighting a righteous fight and you've got the tools to do it, but the tools are cruel, how do you keep your humanity? How do you keep those impulses under control and not become the thing that you are trying to get rid of? Again, this is something that happens a lot in stories. in lots of stories, but I think is we're kind of on a precipice at the end of this novel, so it'd be really interesting to see where we go next. So I've got one more little theme that I thought it was probably worth talking about, and that is history. So this is a novel that is absolutely set in a historical world. It's set. It's about history. It's of history. It's inspired by history. So much that happens in the story is about things that have already taken place. It's about trying to find out things that have happened, and about trying to uncover a history that's been hidden or been eradicated. And I wonder whether that speaks to that history of the historical region that the story is set, of a rich history that's been forgotten or has been erased, to be only replaced by this one vision of things. There is a really good instructive example of it in the story quite early on. Arian is talking to someone who I think will become the big bad in the future, the Black Khan. So the Black Khan is a usurper. He was exiled and then came back and revolted against his brother and took over. But Arian was in the court when he was exiled, and she mentions to him, well, you weren't always the ruler, it was your brother and you usurped him. And his response was, I've always been the rightful ruler. I think that speaks to that sense of history and how it can be weaponized, and revisionists can try and change history to fit their narrative, and how we need to resist that and keep alive what actually happened as best we can, because that's really important. So that brings me on to our section about history and the Silk Road as the first part of things that occur. I think the Silk Road story is a fascinating one in its own right. This kind of golden route of trade that connected cultures. It was about an exchange of ideas. And this is a story about what happens if that's removed, if that route is perverted for other reasons. It's a route that becomes about transporting slaves. It's a route that becomes about armies marching up and down it, and how you lose the richness of society when you don't have those connections. There's lots of hints in this story about other worlds, about the language of the people at the Cloud Gate, and about the influence of kind of the Russian world on there, and perhaps the Chinese world, the Japanese world, perhaps these kind of lands outside. And I think something that is really a hook for me in terms of what's coming is that there are lots of places on here which we haven't really got to yet. So we haven't got to the kind of version of India, and we've heard a bit about the Transcap up here, but we haven't really got to it yet, which would be, I suppose, the Urals, kind of Ukraine, maybe up that way. We've got seas on here which, are kind of Turkey and India. The empty quarter with the 19 is kind of Saudi Arabia and Oman and all those kind of countries. So there's other societies that link in. We're on the area we're in is should be the through of all of those nations, all of those cultures, and we might get more of those in the stories, which I think is really cool. Something else that occurred to me is in storytelling. So one thing I noticed was, the story is mostly from the perspective of one character, but we get just enough switching perspectives to know who to trust. So if we're never quite sure whether one of our other companions is on the side of our heroine or not, we get a little bit from them that just says exactly what they're thinking. We don't follow their story fully. I wouldn't be surprised, given the ending of book 1, if we get that in book 2. We get two narratives. But in this story, it's very clear who we can definitely trust, and everybody else is kind of up for grabs. And I think that's really It's a really smart decision. This easily could be written just from one perspective, and you're always just doubting whether the other companions truly believe and whether they're going to sabotage the mission or stab her in the back at some point. But taking away that worry means that you can focus more attention on the other characters, and I think it prompts you to really think about their motivations and about what they do, and really trust nobody apart from our central cohort, which I think is really nice. And I think actually you get this perspective when you've already probably trusting those characters. It's just that kind of final tick to say, yep, you can definitely believe in them. It's absolutely fine. They're on our side. Don't worry about it. Worry about all these other people instead. So that's just something that occurred to me as I was reading. I also want to talk a little bit more about the companions of Hera. One of the things they really reminded me of were the Daughters of Harriet from Annelies Newitz's book, The Future of Another Timeline. So the companions of Hera, and Hera I think was a city in maybe Mesopotamia, which is, and it was part of the story of Muhammad. So it has a historical kind of reference to it. I haven't quite managed to unpack whether it has any deeper meaning or not. You know I love to unpack deeper meanings. But what the companions are is strong, independent, intelligent, capable women who almost on their own are the resistance. And they're trying to keep alive history, ideas, and trying to circumvent the patriarchal controlling men. Now, in the future of the timeline, this is spoilers for that one. You should really watch our video about it. The Daughters of Harriet are kind of doing a similar thing, a bit more under the radar, but in a similar context. And I just thought the two of them were a really nice kind of parallel between the two, which if you've read both stories, I'd love to hear your thoughts about. What else occurred to me? The Library of Alexandra. So I've written this down because I think as somebody, a lover of history, feel a great sadness about the sacking of that library. It was a kind of one of the biggest libraries in the world. And when it was destroyed, all of this culture, all of this knowledge, all of this history was removed from the world. There weren't other copies of it. And it put society back. I really get that sense here in the Bloodprint. By the end of the story, I'm assuming the Talisman and the Black Khan and the Authoritarian will be gone. It will be a happy-ish ending, I'm predicting. But what I think is unclear is what's going to come afterwards. What happens to a society rebuilding if its culture has been removed? The author talks in an interview about that it's very important that the companions are rebelling for themselves. They're not doing it with the help of a powerful Western ally, which is, I think, what other writers may have done. There might be kind of an outside influence who is, outside of this culture that's trying to come in and wade in and do whatever. It's about self-empowerment for women, for people who value knowledge and freedom and kind of unpolluted faith. So what's going to happen to this society if there is a victory? What's going to happen? If that history is lost, where does that get replaced from? Is there going to be a great exercise in filling the libraries with what people can remember? Is that ever going to make up for that loss of culture? So I think about the Library of Alexandria. I think about the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which mostly were in this region. Think about the loss of Babylonia and those great stores, that great rich heritage that can be lost through the actions of people who are interested in power, interested in control. So there's a real kind of somber undertone for me in the story, which is not about what happens in the book. It's about what has happened in the world. And I hope that the author is trying to get us to think about some of those things, because it makes me think about those things. The other story that it made me think of, actually, apart from The Future in the Timeline, was The Poppy War, which is a book that we've not talked about on the book club, but is a story that I absolutely adore. It also features a very strong female central character who has great power, and has to start to deploy that power in ways that I think can corrupt. Again, that's a little bit spoilery for Poppy War. I would highly recommend you read that one, as well as everything we read in the book club, pretty much. But yeah, the Poppy War I think the other thing that really struck me in terms of parallels is that the Poppy War is also written by somebody who's done a great amount of research into the history and culture of somewhere that isn't traditionally served by fantasy writing. So in the Poppy War's case, we're kind of looking at China and the impact of external forces on it, so war with Japan, and I think probably eventually the imposition of Western powers on an interference in Chinese society. The Bloodprint's looking at a different region, but I think in a similar way, and reclaiming some of those places, some of those stories, and helping to dislodge the genre's reliance on Arthurian legend, on vampires, on zombies, and presenting new ways of doing things. So it also reminded me a little bit of Black Leopard, Red Wolf in terms of kind of dark storytelling, but dark storytelling that comes from different cultural places to what we're used to, which I think is absolutely brilliant, and is the whole reason that I wanted to buy it in the first place. So I think if you're going to read the Bloodprint, and if not, then I would also highly recommend the Poppy War, and perhaps read them kind of one after the other, and just have a think about in your head about their relationship. So I think there are some other kind of cultural touchstones which I suppose occurred to me. I think that the influence of the Balkans and its heritage is also in here. Although this story is fundamentally about the experience of Pakistan, Afghanistan, other parts of Asia, I think there's undoubtedly something of the author's research into the Balkans, the tensions between the various countries that made up Yugoslavia, racial tensions overlapped with national ones, really comes through. I think there's got to be some influence there in terms of not only what people do to other people on the basis of just how they look or what they think, but also about those kind of dire consequences of what happens when that occurs. And I think also that kind of there's some of that complexity of those kind of tribal relationships is really helps come through because of some of that other knowledge. So the story becomes not only about Asia, but also about the Balkans, which I think is really interesting. The other things I've got written down, because we're coming towards the end of the stream, I've written the pen is mightier than the sword. And I think that's probably about bang on in terms of storytelling. I don't think that's too wrong there. I think that the pen is mightier than sword in lots of ways. And this story really embodies that idea. It embodies that sense that knowledge is power. And the claim, and I think we'll probably finish talking about the claim before we end. The claim is that kind of literal interpretation of, well, actually, this is a world where words have more power than swords. And we can perhaps interrogate why that's the case. So two other quick points that I thought I would raise that you might have thought yourself or want to think about. Firstly is, at the end, has Ariane become Evil Willow? I should just leave that there as a comment. It doesn't need too much unpacking. And also an idle thought about blood. So this book is called The Bloodprint, and blood features increasingly in the story. Blood features in terms of somebody's the kind of blood in their veins and their kind of blood relations, non-blood relations. There's lots here about, who is in your family, who makes up your family. Is blood more important than the bonds you make with people and your shared vision and identity? But also towards the end of the story, when we get to north of the wall, you also get blood. So as I'm reading the second story, I'm going to be thinking about, does Bloodprint also kind of mean like fingerprint? There is a blood relation that appears at the end that I won't necessarily get too much into. There's the blood shed, there's about blood sacrifice. There is lots of stuff going on to do with blood here that I think that I want to know more about when we get to second, third, fourth books, and that this might be a theme that expands. There's the bloodless. So where does blood fit into this world, into this story? If you've only read the first one, drop your comments in the chat. I'd love to know what you think, because I don't think I've quite got it in my head yet, and I probably will need to read all of the stories before I get to that end point. So let's finish for the last kind of minute or so talking about the claim. So the claim is this kind of magical underpinning of this world, and the claim is an interesting one for me. I think one thing I found quite interesting was the magic comes alive when words are spoken, which is kind of standard magic. But what is interesting, I think, is that the words themselves specifically don't always match the impact of those words. So a phrase can do something, but the phrase doesn't mean the thing that's just happened. So there's a connection here to, is it just the uttering of any of the words for some of our characters will have an effect, or are there underlying subtexts in the words which we've yet to uncover? So this makes it stand out from something like Harry Potter, where a word means a thing that happens. Here it's a phrase and something might happen, but actually it's not always the same thing. There are levels to the power here which can be uncovered from it. So in some ways it felt a bit more kind of video game to me, where you might pick up a scrap of a parchment that has a power. So I think, again, there's more to unpack in this story that I'm really interested to find out about, that I don't think the first story has quite got to yet, which is really cool. And it really makes me think that it's exciting to head into that next story and see what it's all about. Okay, so that brings us to the end of an hour. I think we've had a good chat, hopefully, about the story. I would massively recommend the Bloodprint. It's a really good read, and there's so much in there at all levels to unpack about all of those themes and more. If you have got thoughts you want to share, you can leave them in the chat. If you enjoyed this content, we have got that Ko-Fi link. You can drop us a little donation. It just helps support the channel and support the Cosmia Book Festival altogether. And thank you very much for tuning in.